We're celebrating the publication of Seattle Now and Then, the hardcover best of edition, the greatest hits of Paul Dorpat and Jean Sherrard. Yes, shakes his head. I'm thinking about this because in the many years that you've been doing this, the city has changed. We have a lot of newcomers, but you yourself, Paul, were once a newcomer.
I changed too. Yeah.
You came here in 1966, is that right?
I think it is.
Can you tell me how you became a documenter of Seattle history?
There is an efficient cause to follow Aristotle. That is a direct cause, or maybe it's not. Maybe it was Aquinas. That is, a friend of mine from college asked me to help him research the Merchants Cafe in Pioneer Square, which he was reopening. So it was a function of that, really, of my studying the history of Pioneer Square that got me involved in studying Seattle history.
You were in the newspaper business, the alternative newspaper
It's hardly
business.
a business, but we did do a newspaper called The Helix for about 3 years, and it was best known as an underground paper because it had fairly odd content when compared to the PI, the Times, or the Star. Wasn't around then anymore. But yes, the Underground Press Syndicate, the Helix, and that lasted about 3 years. And these boys that are here in this room with us, but that will not be heard in chorus, but will separately, were young guys when that happened, right, Jane?
No, I was 10.
10, yeah, but he was precocious.
Well, so the reason I asked about newspaper business is that many listeners, if they know Seattle Now and Then, know it through the weekly column in the Seattle Times. So you did this research on the Merchants Cafe. How did that become a column in the Seattle Times?
That's a good question. No one's ever asked it before. Never. I'm not kidding you. How did that happen? I had another friend.
It's all about connections.
Yeah, connections, who advised me that the Seattle Arts Commission was taking applications for artists in residence. And so I applied for that and got it twice. And that took me into direct study of the city's narrative and of its illustrative resources, namely those that would be most useful for making a film, which I never made. However, I did do quite a few things, like do videos, and I did a stint on television for part of a year until there was a material tragedy with it. But so that's how it all worked into it. And then the Times were convinced by an article I wrote for the Seattle Sun, and they said, sure, we'll try this out, and then they've never stopped trying it.
What year was that?
That was 1981, 92. These guys are signaling. They know more about me than I do.
Paul Dorpat's voice is the one you hear right now. Also with us is Jean Sherrard, and this Seattle Now and Then is a partnership. Jean, you're the now photographer, certainly not the then photographer. How did you and Paul get together?
How did we hook up?
How did you hook up in the contemporary parlance?
Well, Paul and I actually met at a festival that Paul was sort of an inspirator and at least partial founder and creator of, which is Bumbershoot. And I was a young actor, and I think we met backstage. So this was my entire adult life I've known Paul.
A young
That's
actor,
not
but
how I
not
remember
necessarily, that's not how you remember it?
No.
How do you remember it?
I remember it was in the Coliseum, and there had been a big event there for this particular, I guess, Bumbershoot, and I was just off the floor, and this giant started walking across the floor directly for me, apparently led there by someone who thought maybe I would like to meet the giant, which I was rather pleased to meet the giant. I'd heard of him, I knew his good works, even though they were young. I wasn't prejudiced against youth. And so there he was.
Paul was
That's how
only
it-
40 at the time.
You
so
were the giant.
I was
No,
the giant.
he
yeah.
wasn't
Well, I
40.
should,
No way.
I should just interject that for folks who've not heard that word Coliseum, that is the building that is at this current moment in time known as Key Arena, and it's gonna be a hockey
Is it hockey that's going
hockey
to?
that it's
Oh, my
going to
goodness.
become. Just so you know, there's a lot, history to everything.
Maybe they'll have chipped ice drinks.
Well, so Gene, you were an actor when you two, the giant, encountered
When I was
Paul.
the giant, I was the actor.
So
yeah.
that doesn't naturally lead to becoming a photographer
You know,
on this
the-
kind of thing.
The story is long and convoluted, but first off, I think the first thing that actors, male actors in particular, are impressed with is when they encounter someone who has a basso profundo. And Paul had that voice. He had that
I've
voice
lost it.
that we
No.
always aspire to as young, because I was doing voice work on the radio and I was doing commercial stuff, and they'd always cast me as like a young Luke Skywalker, but what I really wanted was to have Paul's voice. So that was the first thing that attracted me.
I never heard this before.
Was I heard that voice? Listen to it even now at 80. It's such a marvel.
Okay,
Can I
so
sing for
neither
you?
of
Marcie,
these.
can I sing for you?
What would you like to sing?
Never mind.
Okay. Neither of these encounters that you're describing
Had anything to do
lead to a weekly column that involves photography.
They do, and I'll
they
get there
do?
very
Okay.
quickly,
All right.
because by the mid '80s into the early '90s, I became a radio producer, and one of the projects that I almost worked on with Paul was in the late '80s. It was a 3-minute historical snippets, Washington State history, to celebrate our centennial, and it fell through. But that sort of began a process, and Paul was the narrator for several of these.
I wasn't bass enough, I don't think. It fell through, I don't know why, actually.
Well-
But then, within about 10 years, we were working on a bumper shoot project together, and we produced a history of bumper shoot called Bumper Chronicles for KCTS 9. And after that, we did a Washington State Then and Now book, and from that point on, I've spent the last 12 years doing the photography for the Now.
And I've been thankful because I was really thankful that Jean stepped into all of that and took over.
Because you were doing the photography before Gene?
Yeah, I was, that's right. And I was a coward, frankly, and he's brave and
A brave
adventurous.
photographer. You
yeah.
have to be to stick
You
a
do,
camera
and
in someone's
I
face.
was not a brave photographer, I was a coward.
One thing I've always wondered is if this column starts with the then or the now. Are you wandering around the streets and then
You mean
look
in the
up?
writing of it, or
Oh
what?
yeah, and just the inception. There's something every week. Do you look up at some building and say, I wonder what was here before, or I wonder what this was, or are you going through
Oh, I can
lots
answer
of
that.
archival? You
Sure.
can, good.
The collection that I put together in the last 40 years is a then collection. So the nows are coincident of just my carrying a camera around or going out to explore for the then to repeat it. So it always starts, practically, not always, but practically always starts with the then.
Well, that makes sense. And what we have in this new this is a coffee table publication. I happen to own the prior books, which were not as grand as
They were not
Seattle
as
Now and
grand,
Then.
nor were they as good.
Oh, well, that's good to
Okay,
know.
yeah.
This is the historic 100, so you've culled through 1800-ish, is that right?
That's right, Jean did that,
Gene culled through.
yeah.
Cold.
One of the things that I was really startled by, and perhaps I missed it the first time around, a photo of the Great Seattle Fire, June 1889. It's a photo, an image of the actual fire.
Yeah.
I'm curious, either of you, how did you come by that photo?
All right, that's an easy one.
It is?
Yeah, because there's only about a half a dozen or a dozen photos that actually show smoke or something,
Right.
and that's one of them.
And where did that photo reside when you found it?
I'm not telling you, Marcie.
Oh, that's like giving
No, I
away your
will.
secret?
Probably, that one could very well be in just about any of the major local archives, Seattle Public Library, University of Washington, yeah.
So how do you figure out, I mean, some of them, the city physically has changed. They've sluiced down hills. There's things that have
Yeah,
been
yeah.
constructed. how do you determine where exactly the viewpoint, the vantage point is from which that the then is taken, and
yeah.
then strive to recreate it?
All right. Gene, you have to do that. How do you do that?
How do you do that, Gene?
Well, some of these are pretty easy, because if we're repeating photos that were taken in the last 50, 60, 80 years, a lot of these vantage points still exist. And when we go a little bit further back, when we look at the fire photo, then it's a calculation. We're splitting the difference. We know the general location, we know the approximate height. We can subtract the actual height of the city street as it was then and make a rough calculation of it. Sometimes the buildings are missing, and at that point I have to, because we don't allow drones in city limits, I actually have a 21-foot long pole that I stick up into the air with a camera on top of it.
How does that seems hard and tippy.
It is hard. It's when people walk by, they
Do you
think
remember I mentioned the cowardness?
Is that the part that you don't want to do
That's
in
one of
Gene
them,
will
yeah.
do? Or maybe he's just taller than you, so 21
Well, he is
feet goes up
considerably
higher in
taller
the
than
air.
I am.
it does go up higher in the air, but you know, it's also it always feels a little bit treacherous and risky in a wind. That
I bet,
it
to your
whips
camera.
around a bit. Yep.
I'm talking with, that's Jean Sherrard. You also hear the voice of Paul Dorpat, and they've been working together for a dozen years now on the Seattle Times column, Seattle Now and Then. The historic 100 Seattle Now and Then has just been published in beautiful hardcover edition with lots of really cool photos. And it's not just about the now and the then. I mean, it's not just about photo documentation, is it, Paul?
Well, it is primarily about that, because that's the notion of repeating the historical photo from the contemporary point of view. But I think you're right. You hit upon the point, is that you could take all the historical photos, and they are really the classics in many cases,
Right.
and you could rip them out of the book. Don't do it, please, but you could do it. And as long as you kept Gene's now photography there, it wouldn't be any longer a now and then, but it'd be a wonderful book of the city, because he did a wonderful job of going out and taking the photos of the nows, which were frequently, and he could choose them because he did the selecting of from the 1800 articles. He could choose those thens to sort of placate or improve or,
Well, this also got our producer, Amina Al-Sadi, thinking. We are sitting on the Ave in Seattle's University District in the KUOW studios. Just a few blocks from us is the University of Washington campus, and the oldest building on that campus, Denny Hall, sits on on the proverbial grassy knoll. It's a beautiful building, constructed in the 1890s. It had, at its heyday, it housed all 200 UW students, labs, classrooms, library, you name it. In 1954, one of the university regents thought that building should be torn down because it stuck out like a sore thumb above this modern campus.
You've been reading my text.
So this survived, but it leads to that question of what should live and what can die.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the big question when you're
Well,
looking at history, isn't it?
That's one of the important services we do for heritage preservation. That's why so many people like the article, because they feel that the old city they knew and cherished and are curious about, even if they didn't know it directly, is being threatened by nondescript modernity.
And of course, that story of loss is part of the tapestry of the book and of the column, in that of the preservation of movements in our city. So you have Victor Steinbrook, who watched as one of the great structures in Pioneer Square was torn down, the Seattle Hotel, and swore never again will we let something of such beauty and sort of classic, lovely lines be taken away. And within a few years, the Pike Place Market was threatened. And so, using the Seattle Hotel as a rallying cry, Victor and thousands of Seattle residents protested successful the removal of the market and saved it. So there's that same story of the loss and the potential of loss inspires us to preserve some things
Just
well.
recently, in the past calendar year, a building that I might argue doesn't have beauty or classic lines has been the centerpiece of a preservation argument, and this is the Showbox Theater across from the Pike Place Market, or down near the Pike Place Market. Developer bought that building. There's been a hue and cry. Is that preserving that building the same thing as the Pike Place Market or Denny Hall on the University of Washington campus?
Yeah. Culture.
It's
Culture.
culture.
It's not the architecture so much, although it has got some fairly nice modern qualities to it. It's important to me because it was the first place that I heard, saw, and became friends with the rock and roll band from Berkeley called Country Joe and the Fish. So that's why it rings for me and sings for me too.
So it has a resonance, a cultural
Personal resonance, yeah.
Well, it's interesting to have this conversation at a time where I don't remember the exact figure of how many people move to Seattle every day, but it's a lot of people, and we've seen this massive influx over the last 5 years at least, and so we see the accompanying development that's to accommodate putting these people in houses. Is there a balance, if any, between preserving the city's history and accommodating its growth, or can we even strike that balance, Jean, do you think?
We can certainly give it a shot, but if we're going to have any sort of success in achieving that kind of balance, we have to know what came before. We have to kind of follow that path from the past into the present, and maybe we can chart something for the future. But to come at it as a blank slate, we don't have. I don't think we have a chance of making wise or informed decisions. So obviously we need to be able to look back and see what was there, and what it is that we mourn, and when we can determine, it's because it does have to do with sentiment and feeling, and a classic example of that is the old post office on 3rd and Union, which was torn down in '58, made of Chuckanut sandstone and with gorgeous steps. If you've ever been to the Berkeley post office, you see these kind of marvelous structures where you climb a set of steps, and today it's replaced by, as we all know, a kind of a filing cabinet tilted on its side. And there's no common space. There's no place where we meet each other, where we stand together and have discussions.
At that spot.
At that spot.
Yeah.
We do have places like that, and when we save the market, that's a spot we preserve. There's a place where we can come and say, this is a touchstone, this is what we envision something about our city to be.
The pig or the clock, or the clock or the pig.
The pig down at the market. Paul, is there a neighborhood in Seattle where you've seen the most change?
Really, my front yard in Wallingford, lots of changes there in 36 years. But other than that, I remember I'm the frightened one. I don't explore that much anymore.
Yeah.
I pretty much stay in my basement and try to give order to my archive so I can move it on to a public archive like the public library probably, or the University of Washington. So I forgot your question.
Well, I'll put it to Jean. An area that you've seen that's changed the most in the time that you've been here, 30 plus years.
Wow. Well, it's got to, it probably we just need to bring up the South Lake Union. Has been such a massive change in the last 10 years.
Oh, you're good choice.
Yeah, I thought so. And I think that what we see
don't get
is,
proud about that.
I'm not proud. But it's that kind of change which is really, there are some definite positive aspects to these changes. We're building up rather than building out. But at the same time, we need to be cautious about how we create these structures, and so they're not just ticky-tacky,
What about neighborhoods that are much as you might have encountered them, Paul, when you first arrived in
Similar?
town? Yeah.
Oh, well, that would be anything with slightly affordable housing, maybe like the Central District, for instance, but not in the little registers where there's commercial activity at the main intersections of the principal arterials. But even there's a tremendous advantage if you have property, because then you can gentrify it, and you might even be bought up by gentry. There's not many places in this town that aren't affected by the boom, and so is that an answer to your question?
It does answer my question. Gina, I'm curious if you had a crystal ball, what might this city look like 50 years from now, do you think?
Oh, man. Boy, that's, without an earthquake?
Hopefully without that earthquake.
without
I'm
the
knocking on wood
You
here.
did knock on the on
I
the
did, I
table.
knocked.
I don't think
knocked.
it's wood, however. Do you
It
know
is,
that?
it's veneer on top of wood,
Oh, well,
so
okay,
yes.
that'll work.
Okay.
That would be hazarding a guess, and that, I suppose we're going to see, just because of the way the city's designed, once we go through the cataclysm of taking down the viaduct, we're going to see. I think it's going to establish a series of corridors that we can't even imagine today, and we're going to find ways in and out of the city that we haven't found yet. In addition, what happens when we actually have rapid transit, when we're using the trains? I would hope that we can maintain certain aspects of the city that we have now, because there are places that are touchstones that we have to go back to measure ourselves against, and to and we do it almost unconsciously. We go to particular places and say, oh, I know this. Mm-hmm. I was here when I was 20 years old. I was here at 30 and 40, and I understand myself to some extent by returning to some familiar space.
And he's always the tallest one there.
Maybe not. I think I know some tall people. But it gets me to wondering, as you're talking about this, Jean, Paul, you mentioned that you spend a lot of time sorting your archive so that it can be preserved, which is a great thing. But do you contemplate at all the impact that this work has done on what shaping the city, what direction the city might take?
Yeah, I do, and I'm getting increasingly intolerably proud, and I do. It occurs to me quite a bit. I think, my gosh, this thing has been here consistently for nearly 40 years, and it has a lot of readers, and I know it's had a lot of effect. And so, yeah, I'm kind of proud of that.
So what would you say to the new young employee that works in South Lake Union at that big behemoth of a company who's just arrived in town? What should they know about Seattle?
That's easy. I'd say buy the book. And I'd say buy several copies. Not only one for yourself, but for your relatives in Peoria, Illinois, if that's where Peoria is. I believe it is in
Yes, it
Illinois.
is.
I'd add one more thing to
Okay.
that, and that would be buy the book and then walk around the city. Because I think that there's an awful lot of people who arrive and they find a little space that they can call their own and stop. But this is a city that's walkable. You can stroll around much of these important historic places and see there's a resonance that comes through. There's enough that we can explore and discover. And I think that often when people show up in a new place, they kind of settle in and isolate themselves. So I would say to any of these new employees who've just arrived in the last year or two, start walking and take
And
our
you
book
could
with
look
you.
at David Williams. You know David?
I have
He's
David
got-
Williams. It's a series of walks around
Yeah, he's got a
Seattle.
lot of good stuff on walking
Yeah.
the city, so.
So walk and take a look, then and now.
Yeah.
Paul Dorpat.
That sounds like a wind-up to me.
It
but-
does.
okay.
I'm throwing you the pitch. Paul Dorpat and Jean Sherrard are the authors of Seattle Now and Then, the Historic 100. Thank you so much, both of you, for coming in.
Thanks,
Thank
Marcie.
you for having us.
I knew she has 2 more questions for me. Okay. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna ask that one first. Okay. These are both for you, actually, Jean.
Okay.
So, this is going back to the Seattle fire photo. She's quite taken with that photo. Paul mentioned that that's one of not many photos that exist of the actual flames and smoke of this fire. What's the story? Who took that photo of the Seattle fire? Either one?
Gene, who took that photo?
I don't know who took that photo.
You wanna ask me that
Yeah,
question?
will you tell us who took the photo?
I don't know.
Do you know?
It may be that I do know, but I've forgotten,
We,
so.
there is a story that goes with it, though, and that is
Okay.
that all of these photographers, many of whom had their studios in the area that burned down, were most likely grabbing their plates and negatives and cameras and getting out of the way of the fire. And the handful that were left, who were looking from above or north or south of the fire, they only managed to take a handful of photos. And so everyone else was just grabbing what they could and getting out of the way.
And what we see in this photo, it's taken from behind the crowd. So
Right.
the person's up at maybe second floor level, I would imagine. Second or
Probably
third.
second floor, and it's
Okay.
at First and Spring. looking
And
down
they're
south.
looking at a group of people, and those people are looking at smoke,
At the smoke,
at the
fire.
smoke.
And if you look high up on the Fry Opera House, which burned down in the fire, you see a tiny little figure who's closest to the fire, overlooking it. And there's kind of a wonderful, he has the vantage point. Miraculously, of course, no one died in this fire. 30 square blocks disappeared, but no one died. But as Paul said, only a handful of photographs were taken because it's people were watching and they were running away.
I think that particular photo was taken from a sidewalk covering, a shelter for the pedestrians.
So somebody was,
They
I'm
climbed
assuming
up
it's a
on
he.
that, yeah, I
Okay.
think.
But it's up,
It's
because
up, it's
It is up,
definitely up,
yeah.
yeah.
To repeat it, I had to use my pole again.
That
so
21 foot
that
pole.
21
It's
footer.
22 footer, 21 feet?
21 feet.
21
Yeah.
footer.
I have another story. You mentioned, both of you, walking around the city and thinking about touchstones here that still exist. What are some of those touchstones?
Well, for me, I think, I've mentioned it several times, but the market is a central touchstone. And we find them, I guess a lot of these places are subjective and personal. But I think for just about everyone who shows up, we go to the market and find a place that we've been going to. My mother went to the market. My grandmother went to the market. Another one is Fremont. There are places in Fremont that have still, I think, that we can walk past, and you still have a sense of being at the center of someone's universe.
Fremont's a wonderful neighborhood.
I love
It is.
Fremont, but it has changed greatly in the 30-plus years that I've
Great
been there.
Mexican soup there, I just had some last week.
I'm not sure if that qualifies as a touchstone. Paul, is there a favorite place that still exists for you that you would tell a newcomer to go look at and contemplate the nature
Just
of the
jump
city?
right on with Gene and do the market.
It would be the market for you as well?
There's one place that Paul, he's not doing it right now, but for about 30 years, he took a video of every single trip he made across the Fremont Bridge. So the Fremont Bridge is certainly a touchstone. I mean, I know this because I've sat in the car and cursed him as we slowly drove across the
Wait,
bridge.
he's driving and
Well, he has done it while driving, but not anymore.
No, he'd be driving in that instance,
while you were
and I would be
videotaping.
telling him to don't be so bumpy,
Right, slow down.
slow
Jim.
down.
What is it about the Fremont Bridge that captures your imagination?
Well, I imagine editing all of those images and creating a buzzing, adventure of bridge crossing. But the truth is, and remember the point about courage at the beginning of the interview?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm afraid of bridges. So this was a way of confronting my fright.
Well, it also was occupying you as you drove over
That's what
the
I
bridge.
mean,
Yes, and you didn't have to
confronting,
think
yeah.
about crossing. Yes, I feel that way about heights. So
I do too. I've got plenty of others. After the show, why don't we go through our list?
phobias in
Yeah.
town.
All right.
I can add one more and
Okay,
cut it
please.
out. I grew up in, my first memory is of Yesler Terrace, because my dad was a doctor in the hospital right next door, which is now Harborview. And so my very first memory is looking from the housing that my family was staying in, from these little tenements, down to Smith Tower. It was one of the great views of Seattle. So for me, personally, Smith Tower has, it's a spectacle, and I never fail to appreciate it in all its glory from every side.
I'm gonna add mine now, since we're reminiscing.
Yeah.
If people go down to Western Avenue and they're down near the Olympic Sculpture Park, there are two, they're now rented out to artists. There are two cottages that have been preserved that I think were ship worker cottages, 3 cottages, Paul says. And they're from the early 1900s, if I'm not
maybe
mistaken.
even, yeah.
And they're,
I did a story on that. That's one of the 1800 stories.
and that is how I went and looked at them, and they're still there, and they're lovely, and I think that there's residencies,
Oh, yeah.
little writing residencies there.
Yeah.
And that's what Seattle used to look like at one point in time.
Well, okay. I'm not arguing with a local.
Okay, you can cut that out.
No, you leave that in.
I love those cottages, and I'm sure they would be really abysmal to be staying in, because they don't look insulated, or even that they have.
Oh, those are insulated.
Are
They,
they?
yeah, they
They're
must have
really
insulated.
sweet.
And all the work they did on those.
Well, what I was thinking about, when I think about Seattle, I have a couple of friends who live in West Seattle, and when I go over there, it feels like Seattle to me still. But, is that where you live, Clay? West Seattle? Doesn't it feel like Seattle? And when I come here,
Well, particularly the U District. I mean, the changes here. You walk down Brooklyn now, and it's no longer a
however, I'll be really happy when the light rail goes up, because we live near
Yeah.
Northgate now, and at some point, I mean, I love our one-way little skinny train line, because I live on this side of town. So at some time, when I'm dead, it'll run all over, and I ask Alan all the time, I'm like, what was wrong with you people? Why did you not build this decades ago?
My parents told me this story, which I'm sure you know, which is in '68, there was a choice
Yes.
between the Kingdom and Rapid Transit.
Yeah,
And
the
we chose
Kingdom,
the Kingdom.
Rapid Transit. Ugh. Well, thank you for coming in.
Thanks,
Oh,
Marcie.
sure. Well, thank you for having us.
Well, let's sign a book for you
Yes,
and Alan.
please.
Oh, Alan.
Should we do that?
Sweet Alan.
They have
Uh-huh.
Seattle Architectural Walks. Do you know that book? I just gave
No,
him
I haven't
that
seen
one.
that. M-A-R-I.
CIE.
Yeah, that's right. You're right, you got it
You
right.
can spell it any way you want.
Thank
No,
you.
it really is a study in, alteration.
Yeah, yeah.
I keep thinking of it as, remember when our parents put up like markers in the
Yeah.
doorways?
Yes.
and
We
you'd
have one.
stand up against them.
Mm-hmm.
And you, as a parent, you keep them
Yeah.
forever. You don't. You want to see. Oh, you just. That's sort of what it means to wander through a column like this.
Yeah.
Paul's been doing it for 37 years, but it's how we measure ourselves. It really is. I mean.
Jean, here, this is to Marcie.
Okay.
And Alan.
And Alan.
This
You
is
can write
Alan,
in.
too?
Yeah, add
Sure.
Alan. Yeah, he'll be happy. Yeah, where have I've been I hang out sometimes in Pioneer Square, because there's a lot of art things, and, there is some history there in the buildings.
Is it Alan, A-L-L-A-N or
One
E-N?
A-L-A-N, one L, one
God,
A,
why
two
people
A's.
don't.
You can spell
Why
the
can't
same
they
thing.
just obey the central naming commission?
Well, I'd have to ask his mom and dad, who, okay. Gene, are you the right one? I'm going to hand you this.
Thank you very
The thing that
much.
stood out to me looking through these
You
pictures
could
is
trip
how
on. Do
many
you want to get
places
around behind
I
me?
will
used
get
to
around
be
behind
water,
you.
Yes.
and we now have concrete,
I know.
parking lots built over them.
Oh my
So I
gosh.
just thought, after the earthquake or whenever,
Okay.
that's not gonna be a fun